Hey everyone, Jakinto here. Today I'll be going over how you can optimally generate and spend runic power as a Blood Death Knight. I'll be covering the basics of runic power, synergies that talents and abilities have with runic power, common misuses of runic power, and how you can optimally generate and optimally spend your runic power. Runic power is one of Death Knight's two resources, the second one being runes. On my screen, runic power is shown about in the middle of the screen, just below my abilities here. Runic power is used on powerful damaging and healing abilities that really contribute a lot to your mitigation. At baseline, without any buffs, your runic power is capped at 125. Now how is runic power generated as a Blood Death Knight? Each rune you spend generates 10 runic power. Some abilities may generate more than that, but every time that you spend one rune, you're guaranteed 10 runic power. So when we're talking about really optimizing your runic power generation, we really want to optimize our rune spending as well. Now let's look at the synergies that runic power has with abilities, talents, and powers. The first ability that plays a crucial role in generating runic power is Heartstrike. Now Heartstrike costs 1 rune, so at baseline it'll already generate 10 runic power. On top of that, it has an additional effect where it generates 5 extra runic power. So in total, without any additional modifications, Heartstrike will generate 15 runic power at a baseline. Apart from the Venthyr Covenant ability, this is the only ability that you have that will generate more than 10 runic power per rune. So really optimizing the amount of Heartstrikes that you do in a dungeon or in a raid boss fight is very important to generate the most amount of runic power. Next up, we're going to look at the talent of Heartbreaker. Heartbreaker generates 2 additional runic power per enemy hit by Heartstrike. And if we go back to Heartstrike here, it does show that additional effect of 2 extra runic power. This might not seem like too much on a single target fight, as it's only 2 additional runic power per Heartstrike. But when you get into multiple target situations, it definitely starts to add up. So at baseline, Heartstrike already attacks 1 additional enemy as long as they're in melee range of you and they're in front of you. So if you have 2 or more enemies, Heartstrike will hit 2 enemies and be generating 2 runic power per enemy hit, plus its 15 runic power it baseline generates. So that's already 19 runic power, which is almost double the amount that you get for spending 1 rune. Now to further this synergy, we're going to look at Death and Decay. So Death and Decay alone only generates that 10 runic power for the 1 rune you use for it. If you're using Death and Decay in a Crimson Scourge proc, it will not generate any runic power unless you took a certain talent, which we'll get into in a bit. Now the main contributor for Death and Decay to your runic power is its synergy between Heartbreaker and Heartstrike. So as you can see, when you're standing in your Death and Decay, Heartstrike will strike 3 additional enemies. This means that Heartstrike can now strike up to 5 enemies in total while standing in your Death and Decay. Now if you pair that with your Heartbreaker, this means that if you are hitting 5 enemies with your Heartstrike, that'll be 10 additional runic power that you're generating per Heartstrike. And in total, that will be 25 runic power per Heartstrike. Now this is a large amount of runic power you're able to generate. With Death and Decay lasting for 10 seconds and being on a 15-second cooldown, you're able to get a 66.6% uptime on this. Now this won't always be possible as you might be kiting or you might have to move your enemies out of the Death and Decay, but when you can, it is best to stay in there to generate that extra runic power. The next synergy we have with runic power is with our Dancing Rune weapon. While Dancing Rune weapon is active, our Heartstrikes generate 5 additional runic power. That means that without any additional add-ons, Heartstrike will generate 20 runic power while Dancing Rune weapon is active. If you pair this for Heartbreaker, it'll generate 22 runic power for a single target. If you're jumping up to 5 targets standing in your Death and Decay, this will be 30 runic power per Heartstrike while Dancing Rune weapon is active. So while this cooldown is up, you definitely want to make sure you're Heartstriking as much as possible to get as much runic power as you can. Ossuary also has great impact on your runic power usage. It increases your maximum runic power by 10, and it decreases the runic power cost of your Deathstrike by 5. Having Ossuary active will save you runic power due to this decreased Deathstrike cost, and it will allow you to pool more runic power up to 135 runic power. So definitely always make sure you're able to have Ossuary active with your 5 stacks of Bone Shield. It's also important to note that when using Mirror End, you'll receive 20 runic power because it does cost 2 runes. This is the only ability that costs more than 1 rune, so that's why you'll be getting so much more runic power out of this. The final ability that we'll talk about that has synergy with your runic power is the Venthyr Covenant ability, Swarming Mists. Every time Swarming Mists deals damage to an enemy, it generates 3 runic power, to a maximum of 15 runic power per second. Swarming Mists also cost 1 rune, so you'll get that 10 runic power baseline from that as well. Swarming Mists ticks for 9 times over its 8-second duration, as when you press the button, it ticks right away. This means that in total, if you have 5 enemies you're able to use Swarming Mists on, you can generate 145 runic power just with this one ability. This is a ton of runic power, and this is really why Venthyr is amazing for Mythic Plus. The Blood Elf Racial Arcane Torrent will also generate your runic power. It generates 20 runic power and it's on a 2-minute cooldown. Unless you really need to dispel enemies, it's generally not worth using over a rune. But if you don't need this dispel, you can use Arcane Torrent if you're about to enter a pack, or if you're kiting enemies and you need runic power. Next up, we'll look at other talents that have great synergy with your runic power. Relish in Blood makes your Crimson Scourge procced Death and Decays generate 10 runic power. Usually when you get a Crimson Scourge proc, your free Death and Decays will not generate any runic power. But with Relish in Blood, it'll generate that 10 runic power just like you used a rune, but it was free. This is a nice amount of runic power, it'll net you a good amount throughout a dungeon or a boss fight. Blood Tap is definitely worth noting as well. Although it doesn't give you runic power directly from using the ability, it gives you 1 rune back that allows you to use that rune on something else that can generate runic power. For example, you can use that 1 rune you got back on a Heart Strike, which can generate you a lot of runic power. Even if you have to use it on Rune Tap or a Marrow Rend, it's still 1 rune that you wouldn't have otherwise, and it's 10 extra runic power at the very minimum. The last talent we'll cover here is Red Thirst. For each 10 runic power that you spend, the cooldown of Vampiric Blood is reduced by 1.5 seconds. This doesn't contribute to your runic power gain at all, but you are able to decrease the cooldown of your Vampiric Blood by a large amount by using your runic power while it's on cooldown. Next up, we have legendary powers that have some effect on your runic power. The first one we have is Brindair's Might. Brindair's Might will refund 15% of the runic power spent on your Death Strike if you healed yourself for more than 10% of your maximum health. This will be around 6 runic power back every time you Death Strike, and this is a good amount as you'll be able to get past this threshold pretty easily. Crimson Rune Weapon decreases the cooldown of your Dancing Rune Weapon and also increases your rune generation. More Dancing Rune Weapons in a fight or a dungeon will lead to more runic power. Additionally, having more rune generation means that you're able to use more runes throughout a fight or a dungeon, and that leads to more runic power generation as well. This legendary does tend to fall off of other legendaries and won't net you as much runic power, but it's still worth noting. Super Strain is also a legendary that will generate you runic power. This is due to the Frost Fever disease. Each time Frost Fever ticks, it has a chance to generate you 5 runic power. So the more enemies that you have on Frost Fever, the higher the chance you're able to generate 5 runic power. And this runic power of generation really shouldn't be taken lightly. Over a course of a 30 to 40 minute dungeon, this usually nets me around 800 to 1000 runic power in total, which is a ton of runic power just due to this legendary. Now we're going to look at Conduits, which affect your runic power. First up, we have Meat Shield, which increases the duration of your Dancing Rune Weapon by 3 seconds. This means you're able to use more Heart Strikes within the time that Dancing Rune Weapon is active, thus generating more runic power. Spirit Drain is also an amazing conduit to have, primarily in Mythic Plus. Every time you interrupt an enemy, you gain runic power. How much runic power you get does depend on what level conduit that you have. At 226, you get 16 runic power per interrupt. This can definitely lead to a good chunk of runic power and save you in some situations where you only need a bit more runic power to get a Death Strike. It's also worth noting that your haste has some synergy in your runic power generation as well. Haste increases the speed that your runes regenerate. So if your runes regenerate faster, you'll be able to use more runes throughout the course of a fight or a dungeon, thus being able to generate more runic power. So for this reason, haste is definitely a great stat to have. Finally, we're going to look at Runeforges that affect your runic power. Rune of Hysteria increases your runic power by 20, and has a chance to give you a proc that increases your runic power generation by 20% for 8 seconds. Now this proc has quite a large uptime, and 20% runic power generation is a large amount. This rune is definitely a viable rune to use on your weapon. It's mainly used as a defensive option in case you're needing more Death Strikes in order to heal up more. So that was definitely a lot of synergies that we covered, and that's a lot to keep in mind throughout a fight. Now we're going to look at common mistakes when it comes to runic power generation and runic power spending. The first mistake that I see regularly is not using Heart Strike enough. Always remember, Heart Strike is your main runic power generator. A lot of times people may be too caught up in keeping their Bone Shield stacks up that they won't be optimizing their Heart Strike usage. Always remember that if you're above 8 stacks of Bone Shield or more, it's not worth using a Marrow Rend. If you're in this 8 to 10 stack range of Bone Shield, you want to be spending your runes on Heart Strikes to generate runic power. This doesn't mean you necessarily have to use Marrow Rend right at 7 stacks of Bone Shield. Sometimes when you're at 7 stacks of Bone Shield, you might need more runic power in order to Death Strike more frequently. If this is the case, you should continue Heart Striking until you're down to 5 stacks of Bone Shield. So really optimize the amount of runic power generation and know when you need that runic power generation in order to spend it on Death Strikes. The second most common mistake that I see is not using your synergies between Heart Strike, Heartbreaker, Dancing Rune Weapon, and Death and Decay enough. So always remember that when standing in your Death and Decay, you do want to be using as many Heart Strikes as possible. If you have to kite or move away for a mechanic, definitely prioritize that instead, but if you're able to stand in your Death and Decay, make sure you're inside of it and using your Heart Strikes. And do make sure you're making good use of your Heartbreaker talent. You do need to be in melee range of other enemies in order for your Heart Strike to attack them. For example, I have 2 enemies in front of me. If I stand right here and press Heart Strike, I'll only be hitting the one. For me to hit the second enemy, I have to be in melee range of both enemies, and they both have to be in front of me. So if I move here, between the 2 enemies, I'll now be hitting both enemies with Heart Strike. And if I move further to the right here and target the other enemy, I won't be hitting that left enemy anymore. So your positioning when using Heart Strike is definitely crucial. The third mistake with generating runic power is not keeping an eye on your runes. You should always have at least 3 runes on cooldown at a time. If you don't, you're essentially wasting runes, which is in turn wasting runic power. Since each rune is a baseline of 10 runic power, every rune that could have been regenerating could have been at least 10 runic power. So make sure you do have 3 runes regenerating at all times to maximize your runic power gain. The fourth mistake with runic power is overcapping on runic power. You want to make sure you're not overcapping on runic power. If you use a rune when you're at runic power capacity, you're essentially wasting runic power. You won't gain any of that runic power, and it could have went towards an additional Death Strike usage. So now I'm going to showcase all the synergies that I talked about earlier and how we can optimally generate runic power. So if I use one rune, say on a rune tap, I'll generate 10 runic power. Now if I use a Heart Strike without the Heartbreaker talent, I'll generate 15 runic power. And even if I went between these 2 targets, since I don't have Heartbreaker, it'll still be 15 runic power. Now with Heartbreaker talent taken, I can generate 17 runic power on a single target, or with multiple targets, I can generate even more. So with 2 targets hit, that'll be 19 runic power. Now with Dancing Rune Weapon active, we can generate 5 additional runic power. To further this, if we drop our Death and Decay, and we stand in it, we can generate lots of runic power as we have 3 targets there, 15 from Heart Strike, 2 per enemy, so that's 21 runic power in total. And again, this does go up to 5 targets, so 25 runic power for the 5 targets. Now I'm going to show you the runic power generated by Super Strain. So if I use a Blood Boil, it applies Frost Fever to all the targets there. I'm not using any runes right now. As you can see, we already got back 5 runic power. And every time Frost Fever ticks, it has a chance at generating runic power. It is RNG. You might not generate a lot right away at this, or you might generate it every tick. So for optimal runic power generation, make sure you're using your runes efficiently. Make sure 3 runes are always regenerating. Use as many Heart Strikes as you can while keeping your Bone Shield above 5 stacks. While you have Heartbreaker, when you drop your Death and Decay, use as many Heart Strikes as you can. And when you have Dancing Rune Weapon active, use as many Heart Strikes there as you can as well. So a large portion of your runic power generation comes down to your Heart Strike usage, as you can see. Sometimes in Mythic Plus, you might have to kite, or you might have to be away from the boss at range. If this is the case, you can still generate runic power. If you're kiting, throw Chains of Ice on the targets, and you'll generate 10 runic power per Chains of Ice that you do. Since it costs 1 rune, it'll generate that 10 runic power. If you don't need to slow your enemy, or if you're fighting a boss, you can use Death Caress to generate runic power as well. If you are doing this, make sure you're not using up all of your runes. Ideally, you'd want 3 runes regenerating and 3 runes active by the time you're able to go back into your enemy. This will make sure you have runes for Mirror Ends if you need your Bone Shield stacks, or for Heart Strikes for additional runic power. But if you're away from your target for a long period of time, it's definitely good to make sure you're not rune capping and using those runes to generate runic power. Now we're going to look at how you can optimally spend your runic power. Death Strike is going to be your main runic power spender. You really want to use all your runic power using your Death Strike. We also do have Death Coil as a runic power spender, but we really never want to be using Death Coil. Even though you are able to heal yourself while Lichborn is active by using Death Coil on yourself, it's not worth using this healing generally. Using the runic power on Death Strike will net you more damage as well as more healing. There's only really a very specific situation where you should Death Coil yourself. This is where you're kiting enemies away, you aren't in range of them to Death Strike, but you have Lichborn active that you can use on yourself. If you have to Death Coil yourself once in order to save yourself from a killing blow, you can do that. But in most cases when you're kiting away, your healer is able to heal you up enough, you won't have to Death Coil yourself. I really haven't encountered a time in Mythic Plus where I do need to Death Coil myself, so I just play it safe and just use the runic powers on Death Strike. If you're low on health, you need to Death Strike but you don't want to go into the mobs, you can always stun one mob, grip it to you and use the Death Strike and run away again. Another rune spender that you have is Sacrificial Pact. The Sacrificial Pact costs 20 runic power and you can only use it when your Raised Dead Ghoul is active. Sacrificial Pact should be used when your Raised Dead Ghoul is about to die, or if you need 25% health immediately. While your ghoul is up, this can definitely be a good amount of health, especially if you're not able to use Death Strike at the time. maybe you don't have enough runic power, or maybe you're just not able to get in range of the targets. So definitely keep Sacrificial Pact in mind as well. The last runic power spender we have is a talent, which is Bone Storm. Bone Storm is a viable option. I generally run Red Thirst, but if you are using Bone Storm, you want to make sure that you get up to 100 runic power in order to get the most out of Bone Storm. It does a good amount of damage and healing, and it can be pretty easy to get this runic power if you're using the Swarming Mists Covenant ability. If you're not using Swarming Mists, it can be kind of difficult in order to get this amount of runic power while using Death Strikes, so it probably isn't really worth going. To use your runic power optimally, it really comes down to using your Death Strikes optimally. And if you want to see how to do this, I do have a Death Strike guide, so check that out. I'll link it in the description below. That's going to be it for this one. As you can see, runic power generation can be pretty complex, and there's a lot of ways where you can really optimize your runic power generation and usage. There's definitely a lot to remember when it comes to runic power, but really make sure that you're focusing on your heart strikes, using as much as possible, while not letting your bone shield stacks fall below 5. If you're doing that, you're on a very good path to generating your runic power optimally. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate your support. Please like the video and subscribe if this video helped you in some way, and I'll see you in the next one.